Hello. First off, I just want to thank everyone for making this event happen in obviously a global pandemic and uncertain times in a number of ways. And I'm honored, and if I'm being honest, a little bit intimidated to be on this lineup of incredible speakers and people that I've learned so much from. So I'm very excited to be here and to get to talk with folks. I want to start off taking a look at two figures from the most recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC. There it is. Here's the first one. It says that to have a better than 50% chance of capping warming at 1.5 degrees Celsius, global coal, oil, and gas usage will need to decline by 95, 60, and 45% respectively below 2019 levels. And here's the second. Quote, limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius or below will leave a substantial amount of fossil fuels unburned and could strand considerable fossil fuel infrastructure. Depending on its availability, CCS, carbon capture and storage, could allow fossil fuels to be used longer, reducing stranded assets. The combined global discounted value of the unburned fossil fuels and stranded fossil fuel infrastructure has been projected to be around $1 to $4 trillion from 2015 through 2050 to limit global warming to approximately 2.5 degrees Celsius. And it will be higher if global warming is limited to approximately 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this is what I'd like to spend my time here today talking about, namely, how do you solve a $4 trillion problem? Fossil fuel companies would like to say that there is no problem. As they argue, there's no contradiction between keeping warming below 2 or 1.5 degrees Celsius and meeting the ambitious goals of the Paris Agreement and their business model, which of course revolves around digging up and burning as many hydrocarbons as possible. They are already putting their billions of dollars to work, and legions of experts, to good work, investing in solutions for a low-carbon tomorrow, like algae and hydrogen and carbon capture and storage and all this stuff. ExxonMobil is, quote, advancing climate solutions per their most recent Twitter header image. Chevron has a whole website devoted to explaining how they're working to create a lower carbon future for all. So how does this compare with how they're actually spending their money? So earlier this year, in a report from the UK-based think tank Commonwealth, researchers Joseph Baines and Sandy Hagar found that ExxonMobil and Chevron devoted 0.16, not 1.6, 0.16, and 2% respectively to low-carbon energy last year. And looking at this graph, you might be inclined to think that European fossil fuel companies are doing better, which in some very strict relative sense might be true. But when you dig into it, that starts to break down a little bit. So 2019 analysis from DSMOG, commissioned by Greenpeace Netherlands, analyzed 3,000 ads from 6 European fossil fuel companies. They found that on average, 63% of ads and promotions for each company focused on green investments. Half of all the ads DSMOG analyzed focused on wind, solar, hydropower, renewable energy in general, the circular economy, company climate commitments, engagement with climate policy, reducing fossil fuel use, and making transportation sustainable. So again, what are they actually spending their money on? 81% of Shell's advertisements looked at their climate credentials and sold their clean energy investments. 80% of their portfolio is invested in oil and gas. These companies are not transitioning, despite what all of their advertisements and lobbying will tell you. Privately held fossil fuel companies are constantly expanding, finding new places to drill, and growing the market for their products. What they're asking the public, policymakers, and regulators to believe simultaneously is that they will voluntarily embark on one of the most stunning and dramatic transformations in the history of capitalism, tear down the energetic basis of the global economy, build a new one, and in the process, leave trillions of dollars worth of profits on the table, all in less time than has passed since Forrest Gump came out. We should not believe them. Decisions about how long fossil fuel infrastructure stays online happen mainly between executives and their investors, both primarily concerned with making as much money in as little time as possible. And that's very strange in the context of other countries that produce fossil fuels everywhere on Earth. Unlike just about every other major oil-producing country on Earth, the United States government has very little direct say over what its fossil fuel industry does. Again, those decisions happen between investors and company management. The government instead hands them land, money, permits, about $20 billion a year in subsidies to make those decisions. Leaving the terms of the energy transition up to companies means it will happen too slowly or not at all. Supposedly more responsible companies have come out with net zero commitments over the last several years. Even these aspirational goals, many of them relying on improving technologies, fall far short of the kinds of production declines that are needed. We have good numbers on that, both the ones that I stated earlier and the UN production gap report produced by the UN Environment Program, the Stockholm Environment Institute, and a number of other groups, finds that world governments are on track to produce double the amount of fossil fuels by 2050 than is consistent with keeping warming below 1.5 degrees. To meet that goal, production should decline by 6% every year worldwide for a decade. We are not on track for this goal. The net zero goals put out by these fossil fuel companies, in the US especially, only set out to reduce the quote-unquote emissions intensity of their own operations and fail to even account for the emissions that happen when customers buy and burn their products. In the case of Exxon, the emissions from its products, so-called Scope 3 emissions, account for 95% of total emissions. So their net zero commitments, their climate commitments they talk so much about, just to reiterate this, don't include 95% of the emissions that they produce. What about companies that are starting to transition and are starting to make commitments around their investments and production goals? Some European-based oil majors are beginning to do this, but what happens when they do? Companies pursuing their own net zero goals can just as easily sell off their most polluting and sometimes least profitable assets. In many cases, these assets are going to private equity firms, to national oil companies, to privately held companies eager to pump them for all they're worth out of the public eye. None of these, for instance, would be subject to mandatory emissions requirements now under considerations by the Securities and Exchange Commission. So what does this actually look like? In practice, in 2019, BP sold off all of its assets in Alaska to a little-known Texas company called Hilcorp for $5.6 billion, a move that padded their own bottom line and their reputation as a climate champion. BP reported an emissions drop of 16% across its operations as a result of this sale. But those emissions don't just disappear. They actually rose. Under Hilcorp ownership, production climbed by almost 5% over the year before the sale, even amid a historic drop in energy demand during the COVID-19 pandemic. In emissions terms, that's like putting 108,000 new cars on the road. Looking at a recent study from the Environmental Defense Fund, the New York Times reported a dramatic spike in flaring of methane at an oil field in Nigeria after Shell, Total, and Eni sold off their holdings there. These kinds of transactions are only growing. Over the last 5 years, the same study from the EDF found that the number of public-to-private transfers exceeded the number of private-to-public transfers by 64%. Twice as many assets were sold from companies with environmental commitments to those without them as the reverse. In the coming years, ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, Total, Eni, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, and Equinor, the largest privately owned oil companies on Earth, are expected to sell off $111 billion worth of assets to adjust to the energy transition in moves that could look very much like those already undertaken by BP and by Shell. Members of the financial sector have argued that these shady deals are a reason why they should hold on to their considerable fossil fuel investments. BlackRock has $260 million invested in fossil fuels around the world as part of their $10 trillion portfolio of assets under management. And like other asset managers, think Vanguard or State Street, they're a top shareholder in some of the world's biggest privately owned fossil fuel companies. In his letter to CEOs this year, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink said, quote, divesting from entire sectors or simply passing carbon-intensive assets from public markets to private markets will not get the world to net zero. I do not agree with Larry Fink on very many things, but I do think he has a point here. Where he's wrong, I think, is to say that this is the reason why BlackRock and other companies should continue to pour money into the fossil fuel industry, on the premise that they can engage and that they will convince these companies to leave $4 trillion in climate-killing assets and profits on the table, instead of selling them off to the highest bidder to make themselves look greener. Despite having major ownership stakes, the biggest asset managers mainly vote with the management of fossil fuel companies. BlackRock likes to talk a big game about its climate policy, of course, but has yet to ask companies to wind down production in line with Paris targets, and confirmed just this week that they will not be doing that. They're in the business of making money, and aligning fossil fuel production with the goals of the Paris Agreement entails them losing money. So here's my pitch. Winding down fossil fuel production is too important a task to leave up to markets. What if, in return for the $20 billion in public money the US hands over to coal, oil, and gas companies every year, the public got a return on that investment? What if the government had the same say as any other major investor in the fossil fuel industry, able to weigh in on investment and production decisions and emissions goals? And what if they use that to effect an orderly, just, and managed decline of production? Thank you. So what I'm saying, to be clear, is that the United States government should bring fossil fuel assets under public ownership. Throughout US history, this is not a strange thing to do. Plenty of national priorities have been deemed too important to leave up to markets. In response to Black Monday, the government nationalized several functions of the banking sector through the creation of institutions like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, Fannie Mae, the Export-Import Bank, before ultimately nationalizing the country's gold reserves. The Tennessee Valley Authority, created to provide power and jobs to hard-hit mountain regions, was formed in part by nationalizing the Tennessee Electric Power Company over the protest of its executives. In 1943, Congress passed the War Labor Disputes Act, which let the government nationalize any facilities that might be needed in the war effort. FDR would use that authority on coal mining and oil drilling operations, as well as railroads, department store chains, and the US subsidiaries of foreign-owned eyeglass, champagne, and beer companies, among several others. The government has plenty of carrots, of course, to encourage companies to meet wartime demands, like federal contracts and government-built factories that they leased for $1. But usually, a federal takeover was a last-ditch effort and a means to resolve labor disputes in many cases. But it was used, and used pretty often, as a stick to encourage companies to comply with federal orders. John Oley, a lawyer in the Office of the Assistant Secretary of War, once said, quote, the government was taking over approximately one plant a week in the lead up to VJ Day. So what did that look like? This is a fellow by the name of Saul Avery. When the US entered World War II, this lumber heir and the Montgomery Ward executive refused orders from the War Production Board to let his employees unionize. So soldiers came in and carried him out on a chair and took over the company. So what would it look like to do this for the climate? To start phasing out fossil fuel production, the Democracy Collaborative's Carla Scandier has suggested a 51% solution to the climate crisis. The government would use quantitative easing to take a majority stake in privately owned fossil fuel firms, winding down production along a science-based timeline and giving workers a dignified off-ramp into other well-paid work, all the while muting the industry's enormous influence over our political system. Rather than selling polluting assets off to the highest bidder, they could be properly retired and shut down for good. Public ownership could also happen the next time the industry asks for a bailout, like it did in 2020. Instead of giving up the decision-making power that such a big share purchase, would entitle them to, as in 2008, when the US government took over major automakers, policymakers would use their new equity stake to begin a managed decline of fossil fuels and guarantee full pensions and wage parity to workers. Any federal support the U.S. gives to the industry, that is, would come with commensurate ownership stakes to be managed in accordance with federal climate policies. Needless to say, there isn't much time to waste hoping these companies will do their part. With its enormous wealth and outsized responsibility for the climate crisis, the United States should be transitioning faster than any other country on Earth off of fossil fuels. And it's easier for us than almost anyone else. That $4 trillion problem I talked about at the beginning is just much less of a problem for the United States than many other fossil fuel producing countries. The United States is the world's largest oil producer and a net exporter. Oil accounts for only 0.2% of US GDP, as much as countries with very little drilling. Even in the oil and gas heartland of Texas, fossil fuels are just 8% of tax revenue. Compare that to other major oil producers, many of them in very climate vulnerable countries. In Iraq, a country the United States has spent most of my life working to destroy with brutal sanctions and illegal wars, oil revenues are 1/3 of GDP and 89% of government revenue. Carbon Tracker has found that maintaining a 50% chance of capping warming at 1.65 degrees Celsius and phasing out fossil fuels accordingly could cut worldwide oil and gas revenue in half over the next 2 decades, leaving a $13 trillion hole in public budgets before 2050. What is a $4 trillion problem for the oil industry is a $13 trillion problem for many of the poorest and most climate vulnerable countries on Earth. The world is going to need to continue to burn fossil fuels. I don't like it, but that is the case even as we transition as rapidly as humanly possible off of them. Among the biggest fights of this century, accordingly, will be how the revenue from burning that carbon is distributed. Countries that have contributed the least to this crisis and are worst hit by it should collect more of that revenue. And there is absolutely no reason for that money to continue to flow to US billionaires that have already set the planet on fire and delayed climate action for decades. And right now, that's exactly what's happening. Excuse me. Fossil fuel executives and governments in the United States and governments in Europe are taking advantage of a brutal war in Ukraine and high fuel prices to fast-track new fossil fuel infrastructure that will stay online for decades to come, eating up still more space in a dwindling climate budget and adding to the stock of assets that need to be rendered worthless to maintain any hope for a salvageable future. I won't pretend that a Congress that can't agree to pass a few $100 billion of clean energy tax credits is on the verge of agreeing to nationalize one of its most important and politically influential sectors, but it doesn't only need to be up to us. I want to just talk very quickly about a company called Diversified Energy, which is the largest owner of oil and gas wells in the United States, based in Alabama, listed on the London Stock Exchange. They have 70,000 wells, 17,000 miles of pipelines, and last year collected $85 million from a single tax credit. As of earlier this week, when I made these slides, market capitalization of Diversified on the London Stock Exchange was 1 billion British pounds, or about $1.2 billion. A government that says it's committed to net zero, the UK government, could buy up the United States' largest owner of oil and gas wells and shut them down for the low, low price of $600 million. The bottom line is that the public desperately needs a say in how fast this transition happens and who benefits from it. Arguably, no adequate climate policy right now is in the immediate realm of political possibility, and there should be much, much bigger ideas, more powerful tools floating around when that opportunity arises again. So to conclude, is responsible fossil fuel production possible? Yes, but only if public ownership is an option. Thank you.